I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about how it's easy for especially racialized white people to misconstrue ideas in the anti-racism space, and then they do want to show that they're an ally, right? So then they take up those misconceptions and they start championing, a kind of cause that nobody was even advocating for in the first place, and they don't realize that they're doing that. I've experienced it many times myself. I've seen it many times.
Hello and welcome to the Chorilosophy Podcast. This is episode 122, The Problem of Racializing Music with Contraband, otherwise known as Will Fullwood. In this recording, you will get to listen to a portion of an episode I recently recorded for Contraband Wagon. Contraband is a podcast that hosts exclusively conversations about race and racism. Will, the host of the show, invited me on to share some of the experiences that I've had in conversations with colleagues who may be missing the point when they try to connect certain types of music and certain musical practices to a skin color, or the social construct that is race. One of those topics, of course, is music literacy. Is centering literacy akin to centering whiteness, or white supremacy? I say no. We've covered this topic a lot on this show so far, but Will and I discuss what those terms actually mean, and how easily they are misapplied by people who really are carrying the banner for anti-racism. We also explore the examples of opera and its history of exclusion and racism, while also remembering that just because that's true, it doesn't make opera a white art form. Will's own background as a classical and jazz musician who also spends hours a week discussing issues like this, race and racism, on his show, makes for an interesting, kind of almost like outside opinion. He's a musician, but he doesn't do that for a living. In fact, Will is a math teacher. So I really appreciated his perspective in this episode, and I hope that you do too. And hopefully it will challenge you and challenge some of your perceptions and conceptions. So as you listen through and challenge your perceptions or open your mind, I would also encourage you to find Will's channel, Contraband Wagon, at thecontrabandwagon.com, and you can sign up there for his live streams weekly on a variety of topics related to race, and I encourage you to do that because he is a really good conversationalist and really makes you feel like you can be comfortable talking about this. And one of the things that happens in the part of the episode that I'm not sharing with you, it was a 2-hour conversation, you're going to hear the part about music. I shared some of my ideas and evolution of ideas related to race, as well as talking about why sometimes white people just don't want to talk about this, and especially not in public. And I've noticed that maybe you have noticed too that I don't care to talk about this in public. In fact, I think it's important enough that I'm putting my entire opinion about all these things out on the internet, and we talk about that in the first hour of our conversation. And then the second half of the conversation is what you are hearing right now, where we really focus in on the idea of racialization for people, which is as big enough of a problem as it already is, the idea that we've placed a racial hierarchy on people to now then be placing it on our music. I would say makes less sense and creates a lot of the same types of problems. So stick around and listen, and with an open mind, and I hope you enjoy it. But of course, as always, if you have responses, rebuttals, things to add to the conversation, head over to Chorilosophers on Facebook and join that group, and you can start the conversation there. So we've done something big over at Patreon, and we've finally cracked over 150 members. That community just continues to grow, and I'm blown away by the support financially in order to continue to underwrite the costs of the web hosting, the advertising, the equipment, all the things that continue to be monthly expenses for creating the show. The Patreon really makes sure that those don't make it cost prohibitive for me to continue to provide these great conversations and professional development for you for free. So head over to patreon.com/Chorilosophy, and for as little as $3 a month, you can jump in over there and be part of that growing tribe of supporters. The producers at Patreon are Brannigan Lawrence, Brian Long, Chandler Smith, Venture Studios, John Warner, Ulrich at Igrain Munoz Alarcon, Angie Schilling, David Kowalczyk, James Mock, Jared Hendricks, Jeff Walsh, Kyle Peterson, Michael Herron, Nathan Hines, Ryan Main, and Steve and Kathy Kakachik.
All right, welcome everyone. My name is Will. You can call me Contraband, and this is the Contraband Wagon, where we're changing the conversation on race. Thank you so much for joining us again. Now, our guest for today, he is a musician and a music instructor, and as many of you may know, I am a longtime musician myself. I started playing violin, classical violin, when I was young. Then I switched over to jazz trumpet. I performed all over the state of North Carolina as a kid, and really enjoy music. So this is a topic and subject that's near and dear to my heart. So I'm looking forward to discussing it with Chris. So, Chris, welcome to the Contraband Wagon, my man. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Will. I'm excited to participate in your show, and I'm just going to start off by apologizing. My dog is going insane downstairs, so hopefully that doesn't bother people as they're listening, but I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, no problem. Hopefully it'll calm down at some point. So, all right, because I think that there is a reticence, there is a fear in a lot of racialized white people about learning about this. There's just like a fear that people have of learning about it. I talk to white people all the time about it, and you obviously don't have it. Like you are here on my podcast, you're very comfortable talking about it. You don't exhibit a lot of what I see a lot of other racialized white people exhibit in terms of having this conversation. And there's plenty of people like you out there. But I would say you guys are in the significant minority in terms of racialized white people. And I think that is the biggest barrier, is that internalized fear of like being seen as a racist or being called racist. I think that's the biggest barrier to learning about this subject matter.
Right.
And I think that images like the one that you mentioned, right, they can exacerbate that fear because people are like, okay, like I'm being on time, now I'm being racist, now I'm a white supremacist because I'm on time, or like I care about learning, so now I'm, and all these crazy thoughts start popping into people's head. It feeds the fear that's already there, and then it becomes difficult to have learning or a conversation.
Right, and I appreciate that because I'm glad that it comes across that I'm comfortable talking about this because I enjoy talking about it.
People were telling you that centering music literacy, like reading music and teaching your students to read music, was centering white supremacy. And I was just like, what? I was like, that is insane. And I've heard a lot of these kind of insane things from people, but normally when I follow up, it's actually not what they were saying. But for you, it was what you were, people are literally telling you this. And so can you tell our audience a little bit about what you experienced in that regard?
Yeah, so the first thing I will say, and I want, because I want to, as I tell this story, I want to make sure that people don't think that I'm trying to tell a catastrophic story. In other words, this is not the majority opinion within music education. This is a loud but small group of people who, as a podcaster about this topic, who can sometimes be a thorn in my side because they will occupy social, like Facebook threads, and generate these arguments sometimes that don't really go anywhere. But so essentially, the argument is this: that yes, music teachers should teach kids to read music, but that we should be very, very cautious about making it like the main way that kids learn to read music, or learn music, is through learning literacy and learning to read the music. And the reason for that is that there are a lot of cultures, and they usually will remind me, not white cultures, that learn music orally, and that we should make sure that we, give that almost like equal time, so to speak, and that there's a certain type of music learning or way of knowing music or way of interacting with music that has nothing to do with written notation, and that we should be using more of our time for that. And by making music literacy the core academic concept in your music class, what you're really doing is centering the white European colonial way of learning music. I'm trying to make that as much of a, like, putting it in their own words as I can. Without,
I love it.
Yeah.
Angel would be proud, brother.
Right, yeah. As always, just a reminder to use your promo code Corolosophy at checkout when you use Sight Reading Factory membership upgrades, as well as adding student memberships. Whenever you go to mymusicfolders.com to order folders or singer's masks or any other classroom supplies that you need, they have a great stash of things that you can use for your classroom, and you can get a discount there as well. And then, of course, sheet music from ryanmain.com and graphitepublishing.com. All of those websites will give you a discount whenever you enter Corolosophy, so make sure that is part of your habit when you're shopping. That's kind of what I get. And that we should really try to work to balance those types of things. And now, my problems with those arguments are I put them in two baskets, like where my problems lie with that. One, I'm going to put it in kind of the neurological, educational, foundational basket, which is that my philosophy as an educator is that one of the things that I'm responsible for with the students in my room is to help develop their mind. I'm there, even though it's music. It's not something as lofty as math like you teach, but it's music. That was sarcasm. But it's like music matters
I
because
was
I
about
think
to
that
say, I was like,
yeah, no, I was being sarcastic. But music matters because I think it does help develop the whole mind, the spirit, the body connection. It also is really good for the brain. There's been tons of stuff like where neurological scans that show how active a student's brain is when they're actually reading music off a page and then playing an instrument or singing or whatever. When all that stuff's going on, it's like a fireworks display of full brain workout that they're getting when they're doing that kind of stuff. And so I believe that one of my main responsibilities is to help develop and foster that brain activity in stimulating the thinking and stimulating the attention to detail and all those types of things. And that, yes, cultural awareness, especially in a vocal music class where we're getting to actually sing languages from around the world, all that kind of stuff, like, yes, that matters too. But that's like in a different box for me. Like that's also like a different part of what I do. So that's one problem, is that I feel like if I were to truly do what these people say, which is to really balance the kind of call and response oral tradition of, say, an African tribal music culture, or maybe like a jazz type setting where somebody's playing by ear because they didn't learn to read, but they're playing scales that they learned by ear and all that kind of stuff. Those are all wonderful things. The problem with it in a classroom, as I see it, is that I'm not qualified to teach some of those cultural musical expressions, number one. Number two, is that I would be having to sacrifice a bunch of time that it takes to teach kids to read music, because it actually takes a lot. Like, it takes a lot of energy and time just to get them to be good at it. And by that point, the bell rings. And they've got to go to their other classes. And so I'm trying to make that argument of it's not about white European music making is better than. It's not about that at all. It's that there was an important tool invented in that part of the world by people at that time who were white, that lived there. But that doesn't mean that music notation must remain a white thing. It's like a lot of things were invented around the world that were really good ideas and by different cultures, and we've adopted them, like Arabic numerals, or certain concepts of metallurgy and scientific concepts that were invented in China and then transported around the world, and they moved around the world because they were really good ideas. Yet when somebody makes gunpowder, we don't say, oh, that's a Chinese thing. In the same way that I don't think we should say that music notation is a white thing or a European thing. It might have started there, but it then spread around the world and became useful to tons of cultures and tons of music making traditions, and hundreds of years have gone by, and it's taken on its own thing. And so these are the kind of the arguments that I try to make, and it tends to be the type of arguments that are not well received, because ultimately this is now where my opinion comes in of what these people are thinking, but I actually don't think I can mind read them. So I think what they're thinking is that I don't really want to have that conversation. What I want is to show how on the side of anti-racism I am by jumping into these threads, because it's almost all white people that do this, and so this is their way of picking up the flag for anti-racism and loudly carrying it into a professional chat room or whatever. And that's what their goal is when they come into the conversation. And so that's essentially what I've been dealing with, because I do present a lot of content on my channel related to how to teach kids literacy really well. Like, that's something I do really well. And so people come to me for advice about this topic, and that usually washes in with the with the rest of it. And I just find it to be a really because again, I'm interested in this, why people think stuff like that. Like, why would someone think that because a thing started in Europe with white people, that makes it a white thing, and isn't that even maybe harmful to use terms like, well, music notation is white, because for the same reason as the museum poster, I want all my students to think of that this is a thing that's for them too. Like this is for everybody. Every tool that we are using in our classrooms for everybody. So anyway, that's kind of a summary of the story.
Good summary. So I guess my initial thoughts about that are like, first of all, I think you are mind reading them. You know what they're
Right.
thinking, like you just don't want to say that but that's fine.
I
Like,
could I could be wrong.
yeah,
That's all
you're
I'm saying.
not. But like, all right, yeah, you could be wrong. I appreciate your humility. All right, so,
Yeah.
but do those people? I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about how it's easy for especially racialized white people to misconstrue ideas in the anti-racism space, and then they do want to show that they're an ally, right? So then they take up those misconceptions and they start championing a kind of cause that nobody was even advocating for in the first place, and they don't realize that they're doing that. I've experienced it many times myself. I've seen it many times. There's actually there's one funny story that comes to mind I haven't thought about in a long time, but I was living in New York City, and I randomly met this person, and we had a great conversation about race. It was a racialized white person, and he was like, his brain was like exploding. He was like having all these thoughts he never had before, and he's like, oh my God, I'm like starting to see things. And then he wanted me to speak to his cousin about these issues. So we made a time to meet up, and we met up, and he would not let me speak. He would not let me speak. He kept interrupting me. He spoke over me, and he was saying wrong things over and over and over. And they're arguing back and forth, and I'm just sitting back here like, I thought you brought me here to literally like avoid this, And I've had other people come on the show, racialized white people, talk about their experiences where, I remember one woman talked about her experience in the black church and how she had to realize that she needed to take a step back. She was always used to being in charge, being the leader, and she needed to like step back and like listen and like learn a little bit. And she had to like learn to do that. Like it was something that did not come naturally to her to do or to think. She had to consciously be like, okay, you need to do this. So I think that it's just people grappling with these issues in different ways. I think that the reason why the people that you're talking about are a small minority is because I don't think most people would have the hubris, I guess, to just be like, teaching people to read is bad. Like, I mean, I think that's an extreme viewpoint regardless of the context, and so I'm sorry that you had to deal with that, but I'm glad it is just a minority of people, and I hope that it doesn't really influence what you're doing, because I'm sure that you are bringing in those traditions in your own ways, like I remember when I was in band, I did drum circles, right? Like we did stuff where like call and response type stuff, right? I did a lot of improvisation as a jazz musician, right? So like I got a lot of that stuff, even though I don't think that my band director was purposefully and intentionally trying to do that because of some kind of racial dynamic. I think it was just teaching music, right? And so,
No, exactly. That's what it should be. That's what it should be. Now, interestingly, in vocal music, so this is where it gets a little interesting, where we think about why, one of the conversations I've had a lot lately with colleagues is that our band and orchestra colleagues are not having these arguments. Like it doesn't really work that way. And part of it is because two things, I think. One, in vocal music, we deal with language, which means that we're dealing more directly with the culture. We can import like a tribal song from Africa and actually sing the language and the words and try to recreate the harmonies as best, like in its authentic state. We can try that in a choir. That's a little bit harder in band, and so that's part of it. Now the other part of it is that in vocal music, it's very, very easy to learn a song, certain types of songs, without reading music, because there's just the echo back and forth aspect. We call it teaching by rote, by ear. And since that's harder in band and orchestra to even get anywhere, like if you've got your fourth and fifth graders starting with viola or violin or whatever, if you don't show them something that shows them where to put their finger down and when to go or whatever, like they don't know, it's going to be very difficult to do that. So talking to an orchestra teacher about, well, maybe we shouldn't teach them to read music every day, or maybe we shouldn't teach them to read music as our main way of learning. They would be like, what are you talking about? Like, what are we supposed to do? And so I think that's part of why I'm dealing with these conversations where maybe my band teachers that work in my building, I talk to them. I'm like, so you know what I heard yesterday? And they're like, what? What are you talking
That
about?
was my response. I was like, what in the world?
Yeah, right, exactly. Now I have a question for you about your music background, and it's related to this because. So you said when you were younger, you played, you did some like classical, was it viola or violin?
Violin.
Violin. And so you played in like an orchestra, I'm assuming, at your school?
So I played in an orchestra in my school and Duke University String School as well.
Okay. And then also did some jazz stuff. So, and this question is kind of intentionally going to be phrased in a way that's a little bit ridiculous because these are the types of questions that I get sometimes. So, when you played your violin in string orchestras, were you in your mind were you playing white people music, and then when you played jazz, you were playing black people music?
Absolutely not. No, I never racialized music. I never racialized anything really. No.
Okay, I'm glad to hear you say that. But the reason I ask again, it was a ridiculous question. I knew it was a ridiculous question, but that is the type of thing that in music spaces we are. I'm hearing that language, and I'm hearing it more in the last 2 or 3 years than I've ever heard it before. And again, sometimes it's the people carrying the anti-racism flag that are using that language. And I'm concerned about it for the very reasons that I've expressed already, being concerned about some of this rhetoric. Because for me, that's really what it comes down to. It's like I'm really sensitive to the way people phrase things and how that could be interpreted, and maybe in ways that they didn't realize that could be misinterpreted. But it's the same kind of an idea. I don't want my students, who are a diverse classroom full of kids, to hear messages like that either. I don't want them to hear that there's a skin color attached to who should like this certain kind of music or who it's for, because I really want them to believe that music is for everyone. Like it's something it's one of our bridges between cultures. Like to me that's how music, in its ideal utopian state, I guess, music serves as that bridge between cultures, and I'm protective of that bridge. Like I really don't want them to think of, it's one thing to like be aware of the history of how certain people, racialized as black or racialized as white, how they might have interacted with each other, or how they might have been held out of certain spaces musically. I think all of those conversations are super important. But where it crosses the line for me is where I hear things like, well, this is white music, or this is black music, because then that draws a barrier. And those are the types of rhetorical choices that kind of bother me.
I can totally understand that, I think you gotta put yourself in the shoes of, of someone who is black or a minority and their experience, I think that for a lot of black people anyway, their relationship to music is different than a lot of white people because music is intertwined with their racial experience, period. There's there's a lot of that exists. So, do I think it's possible to acknowledge that and continue to make sure that bridge isn't destroyed? Yeah, I do. Do I think that's extremely difficult? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think it's very difficult. Agreed. And it takes someone with, like yourself, who has enough knowledge about race and racism and its intersection with music in order to navigate that minefield. I don't think that most people are equipped to do so.
That's fair. I think that's fair.
Yeah, so like I try to give people grace in this space, because I understand that a lot of this is new for people, especially a lot of older people, right, who kind of grew up in a different time or, different places where, maybe they internalize some white supremacy and they're even unaware of it. And maybe they're trying to overcompensate, like there's all kinds of different situations. Everyone's on their kind of own racial journey, so I try to give grace, but I do agree with you that it can be very damaging, to internalize some of these negative messages for students of color, the way they think about themselves, the way they think about music, the way they think about their relationship with music. You don't want to make them thinking that like some music is better than others, or that like or that they shouldn't be focused on some type of music because it's not for them. Like, you definitely don't want to lead students down that path, because it's nonsensical, number one. And number two, it's just not true, right? Like,
Right.
exactly like you said, music is universal. And so but I do like that you said utopia when you were talking about the way that you are thinking about it, because that's what it is, right? Like, it's not the way our relationship with music necessarily always is, right, presently, but it's
Hmm.
something that I would agree, and I think most people would agree, is universally where we want to get.
Right.
So I think that the work that you're doing, teaching that way, is great. Pushing back against those things is good, but I would just ask you to remember that everyone's on their own journey, especially those music teachers, the people who are promoting these ideas. They're also on a journey, and just like you said, it's important how we approach the students and teach them. It's also important how we approach these music teachers and approach them and talk about what they're doing and what they can improve on and how they can grow.
But one thing I've noticed that you cannot predict by looking at a kid what kind of music will light up their eyes. Like,
That's exactly right.
you just can't predict it. And I posted that, and I actually got a lot of crap for it, from the social justice activist ilk in my world, because it looked like colorblindness. That, we shouldn't think that way, because we should recognize that there are, and again, so
I
it's
don't.
these
I don't
these
think that that's color. I don't think that that looks like color blindness to me. Like,
I didn't
that
either.
statement alone doesn't. Anyway, I don't know how you wrote it, or like or how you presented it, but
That
like
was
the way you're saying
exactly
it to
how
me,
I
yeah.
presented it.
Like, no, I don't. I don't find that to be in line with other color blindness, mantras or anything like that. So I'm
So
surprised.
yeah, and I think so. Again, this is where the context of what kind of some of these conversations in music education happen, because one of the things that the people could have been sensitive to is that there are a lot of other influencers within my space that would promote the idea that, for example, if we want to really connect with our black students in our choir classes, we should do more hip hop music, or those types of things, which, that fine. Like, there's probably truth to that. Like, there are probably a lot of kids, but then again, I'm in the suburbs with with a lot of white kids who also really love hip hop music, and that's where it gets tricky. It's like, what do you who's my target audience here? If I try to incorporate something hip hop into a lesson, I'm probably actually going to attract a lot of kids from a lot of different cultures, because hip hop is wildly popular.
Well, I don't think people are saying you only want to attract black people, right? Like, I mean, I think that it's more like you acknowledge that people were kept out of certain spaces, right?
Hmm.
Well, white people were never kept out of hip hop. Like, you know what I mean? Like, white people have not been kept out of certain spaces, right? So, like, if you make a choice to highlight a certain aspect of music because you want to show people that you are, or you want to give them, I don't know, make them feel more comfortable, make them feel like they're valued, make them feel like their music choices are valued. Then I can see that, I guess. Like, to
Yeah,
me it doesn't.
I can too. I
Yeah,
can
to
I
me it
can
just
see that.
doesn't even matter that much. Like, like I feel like the
Hmm.
focus on this is misplaced, and I think that you feel the same way. Like,
Yes.
yeah. So I would be in your camp, being like, that's not a thing. Like, I will say that I'm a jazz musician for sure. Even though I played classical for many years, right? And people looked at me differently when I played jazz. People perceived me differently. I could, as a musician, I could. It was easily, again, one of those things is easily perceptible. Than when I played classical music. But then again, you know, there were I would say that when I played recitals as a classical violinist, I would get a lot of times that response of like surprise, right? Surprise
Yeah.
that a black kid
Hmm.
is like playing this freaking Vivaldi like nobody's business, or like, whatever it was,
Hmm.
and shredding it, and you could see it on people's faces, just be like, like when you see or when you see like a man singing really high, right? Or like a really high
Yeah.
voice and stuff
Uh-huh.
like that. You're just like, what in the world? Like, this doesn't happen, that kind of
Yep.
thing, But when I would play jazz, um, I think there was kind of an expectation, like there was that standing expectation in people's minds that a black person would be good at jazz. But also, it allowed me to connect to the audience members more. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
because they were more open to, I guess, taking it in. I don't know. That was like my perception of it. And then people would kind of express that verbally to me after I would perform sometimes. And so I just noticed that, and it didn't really mean anything to me, right? I love playing violin. I love playing the trumpet. I really love both of them. I'm learning guitar right now. Is that a white person's instrument? I don't know. But like, so yeah, I think you just gotta,
Jimi Hendrix would say no.
right? Like, I mean, there's always gonna be all these examples to go against what these people are saying to you. So
Hmm.
I just think
Right.
that,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
get,
No, and I get that. You come across these types of arguments, and some other just minor examples. Again, they're like I said at the beginning, not a catastrophe. These are just things to point out as I think ways to think about the idea that we're not always right just because we are going back to carrying that flag. Just because we're going back to carrying that social justice flag, it doesn't make us right. You can still miss the target. You can still kind of like think your intentions are good, but maybe here's this reason why that argument didn't make sense. Like that's very much possible for everybody, like no matter what your perspective is. And I think for example, another one I've heard is, that singing in a classical way is a white art form, and it's the same problem there. And I'm like, okay, but Eric Owens and Jesse Norman are, of course, of like two of the most famous opera singers of all time that are black people. Are I can't imagine having the guts to say that to their faces.
I just
Yeah,
think that that's so ignorant. Like
it's awful.
I have a hard time if I heard that come out of someone's mouth. Like I'm not sure how I would react, because I'm just like, I don't know what could lead someone to believe, to have the gall. Actually, like, it's just so brazen. I would just be like, like,
Hmm.
why? Where does that come from? Like, I understand if you would say that um, the opera tradition is, like a lot of, like we said before, like if you say a lot of black people were kept out or gate kept from entering into opera, I think that that's a
Yes.
legitimate statement that you can make about it. But then to then say that that means that opera equals whiteness, or that something like that, or that, or
It's a misapplication of those terms, as far as I see it. Like you're right. So I think the misapplication is that if a space is predominantly white, then and white people have enjoyed the most success, maybe on average or over time, or were not kept out when others were, etc. That somehow then translates into an example of whiteness, or an example of a white, even worse, a white art form.
but what it
Uh,
does translate into is a reflection of white supremacy. It does translate into that. And so like it's just,
yeah.
yeah, it's
Hmm.
just making that, but you can understand that because you understand this subject matter, right? But a lot of people don't understand any delineation between those different things,
Right.
so
Right.
it's getting people to get into the weeds a little bit with this stuff, and dig into it critically, so that they can understand that despite the fact that people were kept out, despite the fact that we're now, I still remember Misty Copeland, right? Like the ballerina, when she was like all the rage as like, one of the first principal black ballerinas ever, like, And that was just like not even that long ago, right? So
Hmm.
like there was this whole conversation about gatekeeping and body types in ballet. And I think that all those conversations are legitimate, like because that's the history of ballet.
Hmm.
And so we could just talk about that. But in terms of teaching it to people, right? In terms of teaching people to dance or teaching people to sing or teaching people to play instruments, I think that um, it needs to stop at a history lesson, right? It shouldn't go beyond that because
Hmm.
we know that what people were thinking back in the day was wrong. Keeping people out was wrong. Thinking that only white people can do X, Y, and Z was wrong. So we shouldn't be trying to continue that in this day and age. And I don't think that's colorblindness. I think that that's racial growth, I guess you could say.
And I agree. We're on the same page. Yeah. So I agree. And one of the things that when we, and maybe it could be at its least nefarious, like just the least nefarious interpretation of what sometimes someone might mean when they say, yeah, this is a white art form or this is a black art form or whatever, is they could be just being linguistically lazy, meaning they're not really thinking too hard about what that could mean to somebody, or if there's a better way to say it. Like you said, I think that was very artistically put. Saying that those people kept out of opera for however many generations. That's a reflection of white supremacy. That doesn't mean the art form is white. The art form is the art form. And if is the goal, that utopia that we're working towards, is the goal to have anyone who wants to access the art form can access the art form. I mean, I think most people in the arts would agree that that's what we want. Like we want a world or a landscape where if a kid of whatever skin color, they're growing up in a class like mine, and they come across a piece, like a style of music maybe that they've never encountered before, and their eyes just go big saucers, like that was the coolest thing I've ever heard. I want to do that. In our utopia, we don't want them to be thinking, well, I can't do that because that's a white art form and I'm not white, or even the other way around. That's a traditionally black art form, but I can't experience that because I'm not black. We want that music to be the bridge between the cultures. So I think that's kind of what my crusade is with this topic, I think.
I fully support your crusade, sir. Very well done, and continue on. And if you ever need me to come in and lay the smack down, you just let me know, brother. Because I hear I get your frustration with it. Like, I mean, that would be so frustrating for me as well to hear that, especially to hear it from white people. You know, where do people get the arrogance? I just it's just really confusing to me. I'm constantly, like I told you, people are always telling me that I'm arrogant to X, Y, and Z. But like that level of arrogance to me is something that's beyond the scope of even my comprehension. Like I literally can't understand it. Like I would never try to put myself in a position where I would say, like, I believe this music is white or this music is black. I just it's silly and it's not realistic.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think about like even just how fraught those categories are anyway. Like you said at the beginning, just the racial hierarchy system. I noticed throughout our conversation you've been using the term racialized white and those types of things, which I appreciate. Are you much of a Barbara and Karen Fields fan at all?
I mean, these theories of racelessness and like, stuff like that things that are in line with that. The reason I say it is because I want people to understand that I don't view them as white or black, right? I view you as a as a person who has had a racial hierarchy put on them. And so,
Yes,
yeah,
placed
so like
upon. Yeah.
so if that's what her stuff is, then yeah. I mean, but
Yeah, so yeah, the theory of racelessness is Sheena Mason. Barbara and Karen Fields are a little bit more old school scholars. They wrote the book Racecraft that came
yeah,
out.
yeah, I know of it.
Okay, yeah. In fact, I've got the reason I bring it up is because those two scholars are. I just think that the way that they write about this topic it is actually in line with a lot of the things that you and I have just been talking about. But I have part of it pulled up here which I think is really good because it ties in with a lot of the things that we just said. If you'll humor me for a second, I'm just going to read like a little bit.
Go ahead.
This is from their this is from Barbara Field specifically. It's from her essay she wrote called "Ideology and Race in American History." This was all written all the way back in 1982. Okay, I'm going to scroll back. Okay, ideas about color, like ideas about anything else, derive their importance, indeed their very definition, from their context. They can no more be the unmediated reflex of psychic impressions than can any other ideas. It is ideological context that tells people which details to notice, which to ignore, and which to take for granted in translating the world around them into ideas about the world. It does not bother Americans of late 20th century that the term black, in quotes, can refer to physically white people because an ideological context of which they are generally unaware has long since taught them which details to consider significant in classifying people. And what she's talking about there is the idea, like kind of the one-drop rule, idea. And so the reason I bring this up in our context of our music conversation here is that those categories, when you really start to think about them in any kind of deep way, are so problematic that when you try to push them onto music, it just becomes, like you said, it's silly. It becomes even sillier because, for example, if let's say I'm in like I'm from Finland, right? So my skin is white. When I write music that a Finnish person would recognize as like indigenous music, am I writing white music or am I writing Finnish music? Now I would argue that it's Finnish music, but using some of these like overbroad categories, like, well, this is white people music. Like, what do we really learn when we use words like that? I'm not really sure.
I think that's a misuse of it, right? Like,
yes,
so,
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, man, I totally hear you. I think that, you're right on the money with this. I agree that we shouldn't be categorizing music by race. Racial categories are imaginary, like they're literally imaginary. Like they were just made up and then placed on us. And that's why I use those terms, racialize this, racialize that,
Right. Yep.
So yeah, definitely white music and black music makes no sense if you start from that foundation. A lot of people are not starting from the foundation that these categories are imaginary because they can't separate the idea that the categories are not real, but the impact of the imposition of those categories is real. And that is the dividing line that people need to be focused on and make sure that they're clear about, because otherwise you start reinforcing the very thing that you're trying to build a bridge across, and you don't want to do that because you're shooting yourself in the foot. So
yeah, I'm right there with you. I agree 100%. It's and that honestly, in my evolution of thinking and studying and talking about this, and a lot of opportunities that I've had to have conversations that have helped me a lot, just from being a podcaster, and you just kind of naturally fall into this space where people want to talk about stuff like this, probably because people like to listen. Also, there's a subset of people that like to listen to conversations like this. Unfortunately, I think both of us would agree, not enough people want to listen to these kinds of conversations, but they're out there. And so, I think that I can definitely remember not understanding the concept that you just highlighted when I was, even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the idea that race could be imaginary, but racism could be very, very real. Like that for some people, unless you've really taken the time to think about how that could be, then it doesn't automatically just pop to your head. Because, we live in a material world. And if we talk about like the thing itself not being a real thing, well, then all the downstream effects from that thing must not be real either, because the thing isn't real. But of course, humans are really good at constructing fantasies to live in. Like, we're really good at it. In a lot of ways, we're adapted to it. And so, of course, that's what makes this conversation so interesting in one perspective, but it also makes it difficult because the person, and I think you actually started out by talking about curiosity when we first signed on, which was really good, because it takes a curious person to even know or care that there is this nuance that might exist, where somebody could say to me, well, I don't think we should see people's skin color as, et cetera. And I'm like, well, yeah, I agree in a sense. Like in one sense, I agree in that race is a made up category, and especially the big categories like white, brown, yellow, all those categories that were invented like in the 1500s in some book that was actually like presented like a science book that like listed out all these categories. In Ibram Kendi's book, he lines it out. He does a really good summary of that book from the 1500s, and I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but
Something like
of just
a survey of Africa or something
yeah,
or other.
yeah, something like that, and where it's like we get these big color categories that represent, in reality, represent extremely diverse groups within those color categories of tons of different cultures and and ethnicities and language families and traditions and all these things, and the author lumps them into these categories, and those are made up, right? They're made up categories, and they mean absolutely nothing. And it's that invention in a lot of ways that we're feeling the effects of. Even though it's like almost like if somebody invented the concept of dragons, but dragons could breathe fire even though they're not real. Like this is kind of the reality that we're swimming in.
It's a good way of putting it. I like that. And yeah, I think we've kind of honed in on a very important aspect of racial education, which is that understanding the difference between the racial categories made up, completely made up, and imposed on all of us, and then the consequences of that. And I guess the next step to understanding is to realize that some people are closer in ability, I guess, to comprehend that fact than other people, right? Like, as a black person, we're not that far away from being able to understand it, right? Because for a lot of reasons, like because of the way that we're situated in society, because of whereby there may be a lot of people on social media talking about black people being victims or whatnot. Ultimately, that's not really what my experience of growing up in a black community was for the most part. And, communicating with black people throughout my lives, most people don't fall into that because most people are too into themselves to do that. Like most people want to believe that they're good. Most people want to believe that they're talented. Most people want to believe that they are right. And so ultimately, people's self-worth, people's internal self-esteem ends up overriding any kind of messages that they get from the outside because they just want to prove people wrong. You hear it from athletes a lot of time, not in the race context, but just in general, right? Like Steph Curry talks about all the time about how he was underestimated, right? He had to constantly prove himself every stage of his career. And I think that that's the mindset that more people get into, or they like give up, right? Or they're just like, well, if nobody cares and I don't care either, that kind of thing. But regardless of which direction that someone goes, I think that how you're racialized does impact how much you're able to perceive and understand about the subject matter. And it's just because there's been generations long of people who've been able to ignore it, right? Black people can't ignore it. We can't ignore
Right.
the subject matter, we can try. And I tried, because that's what I was taught. I was literally taught to ignore it. The same way you were, right? The same way you were taught to like not see
Yeah.
color. That's what I was taught. But ultimately, because of all of these incidents, because of all of these experiences, because of it's piqued my curiosity, and because I was learning about it, I just didn't go down the same path. And there's a lot of people who never experience that curiosity, who never have that spark that makes them investigate, and who never perceive the negative consequences of racism because they're just not looking for them, or because they don't experience it. So, yeah, it's a complicated situation. Like I said, that's why I give people grace in this space, because you never know what people's experiences are, what they have and haven't perceived, and we just gotta give people a chance to grapple with this stuff. I know it's hard, and there are consequences to allowing people that space, right? Because they could do damage while they're still grappling with it. But that's true of any subject that you're talking about while you're trying to learn and grow. So I just try to keep it in mind. And even when I get offended or even when I get upset because of something someone said or did, I try to approach them as the person they are, the human being that they are, the flawed one that they are, like I am, who is learning and growing, as long as that's what they're doing, right?
Right.
And yeah, I just encourage you to do the same, which I think you are, and you're doing a good job, brother.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I think the kind of the way I'll put a pin in this from my perspective is it kind of take it back to my story of my friend from high school that very much knew that he was the one of the 15 black kids, but it just didn't dawn on me at the time that that was something he would be noticing or thinking about. And because you say that like black people can't ignore these things, or or maybe even it's that they're just it's in their face more often. And maybe it isn't, and this is my optimism, and maybe I could be wrong about this too, but maybe it is that it's not that white people can't understand these concepts in some kind of a essential way, like because we're white, we can't understand them. It could be that just a larger number of us were like me when I was younger, where I just hadn't been awoken to, or like just the curiosity had not been sparked in me yet. Whereas my friend from high school, that curiosity in a lot of ways was sparked in him because where he just was placed in a situation where he had no choice but to notice that.
Right. That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Which is like, if you grew up in an all black environment, I'm sure that curiosity would have been sparked much earlier, right?
Yeah.
And I've talked to people on the show who did grow up like that. And so they have those stories. So I definitely think that you're on the money when you talk about environment and that environment having an impact on what you perceive. But ultimately, right, it's about access. It's about access to ideas and experiences and other people's experiences and perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have that curiosity within you, then you're not going to get that access. And so
Right.
you're going to just stick to whatever it is that you happen to run into or learn. So, yeah, everybody out there, give people some grace, all right? Because not everyone grows up in an environment where they can perceive this stuff, where they learn about this stuff. And it's so new to our society where it's like a society-wide awakening of like expressing that, hey, we should be talking about this. We should be learning about this. And this is just for the first time, really, in the United States history. So we've got to give people some grace,
Yeah, it's going to take some time. I've got one more short story, and I think this will be good for me from my end. Are you familiar? I'm sure you are. It's a dumb question, but when of this phenomenon where black people might show up in a space, and even if they don't know each other, there's like a ritual of like a high five handshake thing that happens, like at conventions and different things that they might. So I remember having a conversation about this early on in my podcasting career with a black colleague, where I just was like, so what's up with that? Like, how is it that everybody, like, I know you don't know this person and this person, but I saw you at the convention, like you walked across the room with this big like bro hug thing, and you're like, everybody's taking pictures together, and there's this thing, and I was like, I'm kind of jealous. Because like nobody's coming up to me to do that, and we were having this conversation, and of course he explains to me that like, well, there's this when you're in a sea of faces that don't look like you, and you see somebody else who is kind of pulling, it's almost like your attention gets pulled away, and there's an instant common bond where you don't even have to know that person, but there's like, oh, I'm also one of the only ones here, and there's that bond, which made total sense to me. And then I also heard a podcast around that same time where a study was done actually that intentionally placed some white people in Beijing as like only a few white people anywhere nearby, and what was interesting is they all did the same thing. Like they're just like the three white people at a bar in a restaurant in downtown Beijing or whatever. You're gonna notice, even if one of them is French and one of them's German and one of them's American white person, like you're gonna notice that immediately that there are three other white people in the room, and that kind of woke me up too. of like, well, no, it's not a prejudiced behavior. It's a natural human behavior. That if I was in that situation, I would do it too. If I was in a sea of faces that didn't look like me, but I saw 2 or 3 that did, I'm gonna notice them. I'm gonna make eye contact with them, and there's gonna be some type of a connection there. And I was like, okay, I just never thought of it that way before.
That's a very cool story. I'm so glad that you said that. And like, you're exactly right. That is a human experience, and ultimately,
It's just one I've never had. I've never had that human experience, and that's why I couldn't understand it.
a lot of people haven't. You know, a lot of people have never experienced anything like that, so they don't get it. But like, they're always like, not only do people feel left out, but they're like, how do you know that person's having this similar experience to you? It's like, we know because we know like what it takes to get to where we are. You know, like we know that generally in the society in which we are, that we've had similar experiences. We don't even have to talk about it, but we often do. And we often find that we did have similar experiences. We verify, as we talked about before. So it's not like we may, that may be another mind reading technique there, but like ultimately we can verify all of that. We can see that we're having similar experiences of being gatekeeped, or of being told different things by white colleagues, or, you know, experiencing racism within our different fields and whatnot. We always talk about this stuff. I've talked about it in music. I've talked about it in the law. I've talked about it in mathematics, education, you know, and there's a kind of kindred spirit, you know, relationship that you have when you are in those situations. You know, I just went to a wedding, only black person at the wedding, except for the band. And what happened? The lead singer, she pointed me out, a little black kid peppered into the crowd. And she points me out, has me come up, because we had a moment. You know, we made eye contact. I was loving the music. You know, it was black music. You know, it was like Tina Turner or something, or like, you know, it was something that was not probably very prominent in white spaces, and then became prominent in white spaces, right? Over time, it's like things changed. But she was having that connection with me in that moment. So she called me up, you know, we danced together and whatnot. And then it was like everybody else came into it after that. And so I actually called her out for doing that. I was like, you had to do it, didn't you? And she was like, but your energy, it was so good. And so, and then the bride who I was there to support, she was like, yeah, we realized you were going to be the only black person at the wedding like 3 weeks ago. And we were just like, there's nothing we can do about it now, you know, but we just realized it. But anyway, like, it was fine, right? But like, it does change your experience, right? It is... I mean, I'm comfortable with it now because in my academic career, I've been the only white person in a lot of spaces, you know, because not a lot of black people get to the level that I got to, period. And so, but, you know, someone's got to be the first, you know, and someone's got to break these barriers. Someone's got to build the bridge that you're trying to build, right? And so it's good to know that there are people out there like you who are doing that kind of work, trying to build bridges rather than create division. And I'm glad it's you because you're someone who has thought critically about these issues. You know that you still have more to learn, but you've learned a lot. And I don't think anyone could ask for anything more than that. So
that's the idea.
Kudos to you, my man. Keep doing good works. Keep teaching those students. Keep teaching your colleagues. And there you go, everybody. Check it out, the Choreolosophy Podcast. And thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate your time, and it's been a great conversation, brother.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, take care. Be well, all right?
Thank you all for sticking around to the end of an episode. I hope you enjoyed that. And again, like I said earlier, I hope it challenged you. I hope you got some kind of food for thought from that. And of course, if you enjoy these conversations or appreciate that they exist, you can use your promo code to get a discount at mymusicfolders.com, sightreadingfactory.com, Graphite Publishing, RyanMaine.com, and that helps the show a lot. It also helps those vendors when you go there and frequent their establishments. And then, of course, join Patreon. Patreon.com/Choreolosophy is a great way to help out. $3 a month, and it makes a huge difference in the financial picture of what it means to me to run this show. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.